Well, welcome everybody to the second webinar that the Chaos and Complexity Theories in Education SIG has ever done. So we are very, very excited to be here with you today, and we have a special guest who's going to be sharing some great thoughts and perspectives with us. My name, if you don't know me, my name is Dr. Joanna Garner. I'm the chair of the SIG. And we also have here in the SIG, executive committee members in our webinar today. We have Dr. Serena Cinnamon and Dr. Emma Bullock. And so I just wanted to do a couple of sort of housekeeping things before we get going, and I turn it over to Barney. One thing is that we will accept questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those questions as we go through. And at the end of Barney's presentation, about 45 minutes or so, we'll have a chance to open it up for questions, but we will be monitoring the chat. Feel free to also drop your location. We know we are a far-flung group, so drop your location in the chat if you would like to. I also want to give a quick plug for our SIG. We are SIG 17 within AERA, and we're called Chaos and Complexity Theories in Education. If you have been monitoring your AERA emails recently, you may see that it is time to renew your membership. It's very easy to either join or rejoin our SIG. It costs $5 US if you're a student and $9 if you are a faculty member. So when you see those emails come through, don't forget to look through the SIG memberships that you have, and we would welcome your participation in our SIG for the next year. So moving on, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today. Barney Ricca began his academic career as a physicist and then was in STEM teacher education for more than 20 years before entering the current phase of his career as an associate professor of statistics and data science at St. John Fisher College. He, like his dog, he claims, is willing to poke his nose into almost anything. He has published and presented on bassoons, violins, pianos, technology education, physics education, English teacher education, pharmacy education, math education, statistics education, small group collaboration, and naturally, complexity. Currently, he's working mostly on complexity methods for recovery. He has taught middle and high school students full-time in Chicago, Illinois, and Dallas, Texas as well. Now, some of you may not know this. I know some of you have been longtime members of our SIG and some of you have not, but Barney attended his first Chaos and Complexity Theory SIG meeting in 1999, and he presented a paper there. He has attended an additional 16 AERA meetings since then, and he has been at the SIG dinner for each of those. He served as the SIG as a newsletter editor from 1999 to 2004. He was chair from 2007 to 2011 and secretary-treasurer from 2013 to 2016, and with Jeff Bloom as the webmaster of the second incarnation of the SIG website. He also served for 6 years as the editor-in-chief of the journal Complicity, an international journal of complexity and education. And so it is my sincere pleasure today to introduce you all to Dr. Barney Ricca, who is going to present on the topic called The Death of Chaos. So over to you, Barney.
Good. So thanks for the introduction and for having me here today. A lot has been written about what complexity is, whether it's a science, an ontological stance, and complexity's relationship to chaos. Although chaos and complexity have been linked together in this SIG pretty much from its founding in 1996, almost from the beginning, that linkage was considered suspect. Since that time, many advances have been made in understanding complexity and its relationship to chaos. One of the key moments in this was Edgar Morin's 2007 epistemological distinction between reduced and general complexity. The former is more closely tied to chaos, while the latter is not. However, despite such advances in trying to disentangle these things, relatively fewer advances have been made in the methodologies for exploring complex systems with less reliance on chaos. So this paucity of good methodologies has several concepts. In this webinar, let's look at some of the history of chaos and complexity with an eye towards advancing methodologies, and what might be holding us back, and some potential applications. Along the way, I hope to persuade the field is in need of both a closer look at epistemology and new methods to address the phenomena. The ad shown here on the slide is from the May 1995 Educational Researcher. AERA allowed each SIG to place an opportunity or to have a free ad in that particular issue or one of the other issues. It seems that the Chaos and Complexity SIG was the only one that took them up on it. Before we dive in, I'll say just a little bit more about me and what I think we're doing today. I'm a recovering physicist. I started in physics, and there's the first paper that I ever gave professionally, before quickly moving into physics education when I discovered that physics teachers were a lot more fun to hang out with than physicists. I then moved to mostly STEM education in 1996, and as I said, as Joanna said, I'm now back in data science, which is sort of where I started. And data science plays a role in what I'll say today. My first AERA meeting was with Sherry Reynolds, who had introduced me to complexity in education, where I gave a paper. She and I were working on this particular paper. All of the meetings before 1996 were actually Division B meetings, so this was the fourth SIG meeting. And unless somebody, or Matt Koopmans is here, maybe Brent Dave missed somebody. I don't know if Sharon Friesen was around then, or if Diane Larson Freeman went to some of those early meetings. But I'm the mostest SIG person here, I guess. And if I've missed you, you should chat and we'll sort that one out. I'll acknowledge you. What I want to look at is sort of these ideas about intertwining the SIG and the methodology. And as a side, you should see Joanna Gardner's piece that would have been part of the 2020 AERA meeting. It's got an additional take on this context in the SIG's history. But two strands really isn't much of a tapestry. It's more of a rope. So I guess this will be kind of an impoverished meeting. But nevertheless, I'm not going to make any claims that anything here is near complete. Really, what I want to do today is provoke thoughts more than give you something that you will think of directly. So we've got about 30 minutes to talk at the end. So David Berliner wrote this piece back in 2002, which begs the question, what is science if it's education is the hardest science? However, if you read this piece, Berliner is essentially taking a complex systems position on the question. And I know this because this would also be an appropriate title for Berliner's piece. And you can download the slides. I'll give you the link at the end of this, which will have these citations so you can find pieces if you want them. This title, in addition to fitting Berliner's writing, I believe is at the root of many of the. And by complexist, I mean three things. First of all, education and weaving of many complex systems at all scales and scopes. For this example, as Michael Martyr claims, the differences in achievement between schools is about 30% due to in-school factors, of which about 80% is probably teachers, while the other 70% is due to out-of-school factors. And so he was using graphs like this of following test scores to show some of that. In other words, a teacher really has to be extraordinary. They've got to be, I don't know, someplace in the neighborhood of 30 or so standard deviations above the mean to make up for everything that doesn't happen in schools. And teachers can't get there. Poor principals, they can do almost nothing. Unlike in something like healthcare, turns out we don't have any decent metrics about what to do. In healthcare, we have some metrics on things. We can say, look, we've got a blood pressure, heart rate, whatever, and we know what makes somebody healthy. We don't really know what makes somebody educated. We have a vague sense of we know it when we see it, and we have some things we'll argue about, but we don't really know it. Lastly, in education, we can't get good cross-sectional data or longitudinal data. That is, we can't, it's got a long time frame. And without this, I think the best we can do is something like Dewey's Original Lab School. It's an individualized approach for every student, but they met every Friday to update the student's IEP, basically. This corresponds, incidentally, to how we control chaos in airplanes and things like that, is we monitor and we correct frequently. Okay, so what is complexity? Well, ask 6 complexivists to define complexity and you'll get 7 answers. Ellen Goldberg, then the Santa Fe Institute president, said that back in 2002 at a CSER meeting. So to me, to be concrete, a complex system consists of 3 things. First of all, the system is radically open. It's not just that the system has a context. The system metabolizes the environment that it sits in, same way that we would metabolize food. And then it doesn't just copy the environment, it doesn't just take it in, and nor is a system controlled or caused on the outside. And then the system feeds back into the environment. Secondly, a complex system has to live far from equilibrium. That is, there's always something going on, and there's no one space where you see this is the sort of home base for this. If you think about some of the slime molds, you will see things where they have all these different stages, and they don't necessarily have one that you can say, oh, yeah, this is a slime mold. It's the whole thing. And then lastly, a complex system lives not only far from equilibrium, but this complex system is nonlinear. And this is partially a result of the first two. So really, it's 2.5 things. 2 aspirin may be twice as good as 1 aspirin, but people I trust inform me that 64 aspirin would not be 64 times as good as 1 aspirin. Definition of nonlinear. Changes in the output are not proportional to changes in the input. The impacts of changes in input and output are contextual. So that's my story in terms of complex systems, and I'm sticking to it. If you disagree with any of these, you certainly should raise the issue in the discussion, or maybe you should even volunteer to give your own webinar. For those who have no time, and I really only have one point to make, and it's this. Because everything in education, not necessarily in the educational structure, is created on the fly, and that's sort of the words of Phelan and Smith, who talk about there's no such thing as a decontextualized walker locomotion in. Our methods of studying complex systems must be created on the fly. All the rest of this talk is, to quote Mozart from the movie Amadeus, just scribbling and bibbling. So you can all go home now, or you can stick around and listen to some more. Sometimes I feel like everything I've said has been said before, but that nobody heard it the first time. Ideas about emergence and method go back in education, at least to Bill Dahl's 1993 book, and really much further. Jim Crutchfield, in fact, asked at the beginning of a chapter in 1994, is anything ever new? And in a chapter discussing emergence, he said this. He noted the need to look at methods and what we mean by emergence, which now we're 26 years later, we'll do again. In the very first meeting of this SIG, John Gake gave a paper, and he noted that chaos was an inappropriate metaphor for education. Incidentally, his paper was largely ignored by people after that. In particular, he noted that the difference between physics, the modern science, and education, sort of the postmodern science, is this. Physics has few variables and long data series. Education has many variables and only a short data series. And this is an important difference when we think about how we're going to approach this and what methods we can use. Another aspect of the variable is a choice of the absolute number of variables. As noted above, the phase mapping requires this small numbers of variables, and that's exactly what Gake's point was saying, and this is from his paper. Later on, we find that Crutchfield, a few years later, the same Crutchfield we noted before, said there are 3 things that the study of complex systems needed. First of all, it requires truly novel new scientific methodologies. Okay, and he points out that we can't do the same old, same old. It needs an experimental epistemology, not just epistemology, but something like that. And then it needs something from philosophers. That may be something the philosophers can give us, or maybe something that we're going to need to engage with, but we need something. So complex systems needs an interplay of methodology and epistemology. A few years later, in 2007, Edgar Morin just made a distinction between the restricted and general complexity, and it's been foregrounded in 2 books I highly recommend. The first was Vernon Callaghan's 2013 book, which explicitly engages with educational research and complexity. Vernon Callaghan leaned heavily towards qualitative. I'm not wild about that. I think they sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater. Hyber and Al-Huri's 2019 book also engages a lot with what Morin had to say. And these 2 books in and of themselves are reason enough to engage with Morin. However, it's all, and so we should engage with it directly. What Morin said was the following, and I went right past it, didn't I? So restricted complexity has made possible important advances in formalism, in the possibilities of modeling, which themselves favor interdisciplinary potentialities. But one still remains within the epistemology of classical science. And notice he's not complaining about the methods of chaos, he's complaining about the epistemology. When one searches for laws of complexity, one still attaches complexity as a kind of wagon behind the truth locomotive, that which produces laws. A hybrid was formed between the principles of traditional science and advances towards its hereafter. Actually, one just avoids the fundamental problem of complexity, which is epistemological, cognitive, paradigmatic. In some extent, one recognizes complexity, but by decomplexifying it. So that's what Morin said, and that was his objection. Again, his objection is not to the methods used, but to the mismatch between the epistemology and the use of those methods. He doesn't object to you having a hammer, rather he objects to you not thinking about why you have the hammer and what you're going to do with it, but instead just using it blindly to try to cut wood. In other words, he's refining and applying the old adage about if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I'm going to call this the epistemology-methodology mismatch problem. Incidentally, we didn't have to face this really before complex systems research because the scientific method, which works really well in physics, was essentially developed by physics. And you can see Weinreich's 1992 paper for more on this point. So why is this important? Well, Andrew Gelman, who's a practitioner, said in a recent podcast, having the right epistemology for your study might not get you a whole lot, but having the wrong epistemology is really bad. Unfortunately, what Morin proposed ended up sort of going down this road for many years. It became popular to criticize the reductionist approach, as Morin did, that is used in the study of biological systems, although it is more difficult to determine what should be done instead. Extreme holism, according to which everything is connected, certainly does not provide a methodological alternative. What are needed are new experimental techniques for investigating the unique complexity of biological systems, and I will claim educational systems, that results from the bewildering diversity of interactions and regulatory networks. And so this was actually said before Morin, but it's about the same. And this SIG went through a lot of this sort of nihilism in the early aughts of this century, where anything goes, anything worked. I sat through a lot of papers that were that sort of academic version of a horoscope that presented ideas that in retrospect could be applied to anything and hence really applied to nothing. So what's my main objection to Morin? Well, here it is. I believe Morin was treating research itself as a non-complex object, one that doesn't emerge. That is, he objects to reductionism by reducing the research process, and I believe it to be wrong to treat the researcher differently from the research. There's a complicity paper I wrote back in 2008 that talks a little bit about this type of enframing of things. He talks about epistemology being applied to method. But to use epistemology to critique methodology uses the wrong unit of analysis. In a complex system, reductionism doesn't work. In missing the point, I believe that Morin, and unfortunately Byrne and Callaghan and Al-Huri and many others, will end up pushing against what I call this epistemology mismatch forever. And remember that Sisyphus tried to interrupt the trajectory of life and paid for it with his endless pushing and getting nowhere. I think interrupting the trajectory of research has had and will continue to have a similar punishment. We're going to work really hard and not get very far. The appropriate unit of analysis then is not epistemology applied to research, but rather epistemology method as a single unit. I hope that's something that we can start pursuing, partly with this SIG and partly on our own or any place else. Now, I have to give you a caveat on all of this. Morin is much smarter than I am. So if you got to choose between the two of us, you should probably choose Morin rather than me. The question becomes, how do we work with emerging situations? Martin Buber actually has some insight into this. He tells a story in his book, The Way of Man. And the story goes like this. Rabbi Zalman was put in jail in Petersburg. He was awaiting trial when the chief of the gendarmes entered his cell. The jailer began to converse with him and his prisoner and brought up a number of questions which had occurred to him in reading the scriptures. Finally, he asked, how are we to understand that God, the all-knowing, said to Adam, where art thou? Do you believe, answered the rabbi, that the scriptures are eternal and that in every era, every generation, and every man is included in them? I believe this, said the jailer. Well then, said the tzaddik, in every era, God calls to man, where are you in your world? So many years and days of those allotted to you have passed, and how far have you gotten in your world? God says something like this: you have lived 46 years. How far along are you? So I think that's the piece that we want to think about in terms of what we're going to do. We are someplace and we want to go further. Our research needs to recognize that we're part of a trajectory, individual, and not as just a single event. So this is exactly how I believe we have to treat research. Our research programs are the lives we live, our trajectories, at least professional trajectories, and our writings are simply the answer to how far along are we? These are not great eternal truths, although we sometimes stumble across such things on our journey, but rather a way of reporting. And notice that in our journeys, we take our tools, many of which came from modern science, with us, but we only use them as appropriate. These tools, statistical tools, qualitative tools, whatever, are simply ways to expand our senses in the same way that a microscope or a telescope expands our senses, but in the service of looking at the trajectory of the system with which we engage. What do we see when we look with this greater sensitivity? Well, that's what we're interested in. All tools have affordances and all tools are constrained. So there are three things that follow from this. First of all, the system should drop the use of tools, even though we say everything we do gives lie to that statement. For example, we all take a research method up front in our programs, maybe sophomore year as an undergraduate psychologist, our first semester in graduate school, or whatever. And then we, quote, apply, unquote, the methods to situations. This is the effect of foregrounding the method rather than foregrounding the engagement with the system. The system should drive the tools. Sure, we write it up as if that's what we did, but that's not how we teach it, and that's not how we behave. And we all know that what we write up for publication isn't actually how we got there anyway. Second, we need to consider the trajectory and not merely a snapshot of the trajectory. Too often our research, or again, at least our research reporting, behaves as if we can separate this study from the others before and after. Even our literature reviews are treated as separate from our current study. Third, that's why this SIG is different than the others. It does not, like the science teaching and learning SIG, for example, foreground a topic of exploration. Does it, like something like the RASH methodology SIG, foreground a tool? But rather, this is the one SIG that recognizes systems have trajectories. It's done so from the beginning, and that has set it apart. Notice even Gake's initial sort of complaint about things was about we didn't use the right tool to study the trajectories. So let's look at some implications of the fact that trajectories are important. Again, I make no claim to completeness or even to importance, but instead present things that I've encountered that I hope will provoke some thought. So I want to start with a bit more biography. I really find statistical physics fascinating and useful. Prigogine, for example, was essentially working in statistical physics for his Nobel Prize. I'm not bad at statistical physics. However, at first, statistical physics ate my lunch every time I encountered it in school. I mostly did sort of okay in my coursework, but it was a struggle. Or at least it was a struggle until I had Ken Ford in grad school for a professor. I'd already had some physics in grad school, but I had one quarter with a not great grade before transferring and an entire semester. So there I was taking still more. And it was amazing. For the first time, it all made sense. I could see it clearly. I remarked to my advisor that I appreciated Ken Ford as a good teacher, and he responded by asking me whether my newfound understanding was due to Ken Ford or due to my earlier struggles with the subject. So, with apologies to John Hilbert and Gwen Marchand, I want to look at a piece that came out earlier this year. John and Gwen were the guest editors for this particular issue of the Journal of Experimental Education. And I want to look at the piece that I was part of, Ricca, Jordan, and Bowers, Seeking Emergence Through Temporal Analysis of Collaborative Group Discourse, a Complex Systems Approach. John and Gwen did a really nice job, and it's a nice collection of pieces. A lot of hard work went into the issue, and to be very clear, what I'm about to say does not reflect on them or any of the other contributors in any way. However, upon further research, that the Ricca, Jordan, and Bowers piece, well, it sucks. Turns out I don't really like the piece, but let's unpack why I don't like the piece. When we wrote the piece, this piece was not part of the environment in which we were thinking. This piece was simply an attractor along the way. It was an attractor along the way of the trajectory of our understanding. I've spoken with Michelle about this one, and she agrees with me. I haven't had a chance to talk to Nikki about this one, though, but don't dislike her just because I say something like this. And incidentally, Nikki's really smart and she's creative and a finishing doctoral student, so you should think about hiring her. The piece is our answer to where are you? So that tells you exactly where we are when we wrote that piece. However, because of the work that we did before and during and now after that piece, I have a better understanding of emergence. So that piece allowed me to see its flaws. That is, the piece is now part of the environment. It was the best we could do, and it answered the question, where are you? But we're not there now. And I believe all research should be treated this way. It is but a step on the trajectory of understanding. If we take this belief seriously, then there are several things that we must consider. I want to, for time's sake, just focus on one. Research is a trajectory of progressions, not a series of applications of methods to questions. And this fits well with Weinreich, who said, to engage in research, you must be willing to spend your life doing what you do not know how to do. So how do we do what we don't know how to do? What do we do now instead of continuing in the modern scientific way? Well, after some reflection and influenced by my nerdy love of philology and etymology and things like that, I believe the following is true. Emergence and emergency have the same root, and so I believe that both must be treated the same way. We all have some idea of emergency rooms, first responders, and so on, lots of equipment, standard procedures, creative chaos as doctors and nurses and other responders invent a way to deal with whatever surprise they find. But notice carefully, the goal of addressing a truly emergency situation is not to use an instrument properly. It's not to show how this situation is like another situation, but rather to address the trajectory of the person who's in the emergency situation. Justification of the use of an instrument is all about the outcome, not about some preordained procedure. I believe the only way to deal with the emergence we find in complex systems research then is to adopt a similar approach. We have a lot of methods and we should have more. And we have lots of procedures and we have lots of support. But ultimately, the goal is to respond to the trajectory of the system we are studying without any respect for the conventions of modern science or how things have been done. If modern science works, it should be used. If modern methods don't, then it should go out. This is almost always determined by an epistemological stance. Specifically, if it works, it's justified. So again, to engage in research, you must be willing to spend your life doing what you do not know how to do. You must create tools, methodologies on the fly, just as the trajectory of the system you engage with is created on the fly. To paraphrase what Christopher Zaman said with typically over-the-top language when promoting catastrophe theory, he said modern mathematics was not developed for complexity. Likewise, modernist research methods were not developed to address complex systems. So this, I believe, is what this SIG and its members should do. Practically every other SIG is topic or tool-based rather than trajectory-based. With epistemology and a large collection of tools in our backpacks, and this is especially what I like about a book like Hiver and Alhuri's book, they've got a great collection of tools reasonably well linked to epistemology. We will be enabled to understand complex systems in a much better fashion. Your mission then, should you choose to accept it, is to do what you don't know how to do, to connect epistemology and method and develop new tools. And if it doesn't work for you, I will disavow any knowledge of you. Around the time I became the chair of this SIG, I was talking with Sherry Reynolds about how to build community within this SIG. And the image that came to me was the island of misfit toys. And this is from Rudolph the Red-Nosed, of you who didn't grow up with United States holiday TV in the 1960s and 70s. And Sherry pointed out that the moniker Island of Misfit Toys probably says more about the gift givers and gift receivers than it does about the toys. That probably still applies to this SIG. The difficulties maintaining, growing, and making coherent this SIG probably reflects more about AERA than it does about this SIG or about the work y'all, and especially SIG officers, or will do. However, and this is the point I took from my conversation with Sherry, failing to recognize that this is the issue clearly is going to make everybody's efforts less effective and more frustrating. So what is the issue for research? As I've said before, I believe the issue for research in complex systems, and the one that we must address, is that epistemology and methods are not well matched. Problems engaged by the SIG are misfit problems, and the methods that, quote, everyone, unquote, uses are misfit when we naively try them here. But as you know, few people want to do this work. In this sense, Kuhn was absolutely right. People operate within their paradigms, that is, until they are pushed out of it because the paradigm becomes untenable. Nevertheless, y'all are here. So that is why I believe that this SIG is hard. This is one where the epistemology methods mismatch cannot be swept under the rug. Perhaps the CCT SIG should be renamed in honor of David Berliner, SIG of all. However, if we adopt the idea of researching trajectories and reporting our own trajectories, then Ashby at least is certainly with this, and he wrote this back in 1958. The rule collect truth for truth's sake may be justified when the truth is unchanging, but when the system is not completely isolated from surroundings and is undergoing secular changes, the collection of truth is futile, for it will not keep. So if I were to be king of research, I would institute some new rules, and this would be the first rule. This is an idea that's stolen from an editorial in Physics Today. I can't anymore, but it was there someplace. The first thing is there would be a maximum number of publications that could be considered for tenure or promotion or anything else. I'm thinking 5, although I recall the author of the editorial would have liked 3, and he was dean of an engineering school. Answer the question, where are you? And then let's look at a trajectory. This, I hope, would result in less publishing, but better publishing. It would also help out in something that John Osborne said. He was the outgoing president of the National Association for Research and Science Teaching. And he said, data, data everywhere, and not a thought to think. And he was thinking that maybe we needed more armchair research where we spent time thinking and in a very different sense than what Crutch meant. So much of what I read or hear makes me wonder, is there anything ever new? And it's becoming more frequent that I run across something that is well but not widely known when I read things. So my next rule would be this. We would change things quite a bit. The methods section of a paper, instead of being sort of pro forma, which seems what it is nowadays, would be a much bigger thing. And it would include an epistemology section as a requirement. Sure, the literature review situates the study in the larger trajectory, but typically it does so in a sort of add a piece here, add a deductive. It doesn't look holistically at things. Likewise, the discussion often talks about what new thing we found. What about the holistic viewpoint, or at least the Bayesian viewpoint of our current understanding rather than just the last step? And a brief aside on this one. I suspect that Matt and Demetrios, who are the editors of the International Journal of Complexity and Education, would certainly they'd they'd probably welcome you to do such a thing in submissions to that particular journal. How do we get past this? How do we past other editors? I don't really have any good ideas about that at the moment. And for that, I apologize to all the junior scholars who are here today, but that's what I got. I'm not done thinking though, and there are probably people out here and people even on this particular webinar who are smarter than I am. They'll take care of some of that. Yogi Berra was not the first to express this sentiment, but he said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. Despite the truth of that, predictions about what we may find important in educational research, I think there's some paths along which to make progress, and I think that your efforts in any of these areas would be rewarded. Each of these involves the epistemology methodology mismatch, and I will present 5. One avenue has to do with the connection between research and gatherings. Sometimes we call these things conferences, although must confess, it's been my experience that there's relatively little conferring that occurs in the formal part of conferences. Instead, I think most of those gathering conferences or fences because they do a nice job of keeping things out. But first of all, think about it. Why do we gather? If, as I'm hoping to have persuaded you, complex systems research is itself a complex system, then our gatherings must respect a sort of where are we now vibe in the midst of our trajectories that Buber alluded to. The opinions I present here, and I'm about to present some that maybe you like, maybe you don't, are my own. And as always, say more about me I'm about to impugn. And please be careful with the unit of analysis here. I'm talking about the organization and not about any person within the group. Do not participate in the ecological fallacy of confusing the individual with the group. There are many ways in which we can get that we'll have learned a great deal about these things from this pandemic by the time it's over, but I want to look at one way to explore gatherings. From my experience, one approach to conference, and I'll call it the social focused approach, is exemplified by the Association of Science Teacher Educators. I went to an ASTE conference once and I had a really, really good time. I really enjoyed it. However, the ASTE conference was, for me, a great social event with some papers presented from time to time. Hence, the only real answer to the social type. For me, I wanted something a little bit more. At the other end of the social experience, or in between of is the American Educational Researchers Annual Meeting, or in my case, 17 of them. Although I've seen some wonderful papers at AERA, too often I think of AERA as not great performance art. People present papers to show off. Sure, the papers often answer the question, where are you? But they don't answer the question, where is our understanding? And they don't do it in the context of connecting the before and the after. There's no sense of progress here. And what progress there is takes place in the hallways outside of those rooms instead of in the formal meeting rooms. The far end of the social experience lies the National Association for Research and Science Teaching, NARST annual conference. I've only been twice, and I'm not completely certain why I went back the second time. But both times it seemed to me that people presented papers there as a way to beat somebody else up. Welcoming is not a word I would have used then. Don't get me wrong, there are some really, really good papers there and some phenomenally good work, but the sense of mail was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The answer to the question, where are you, seemed to be all too often, well, higher up the chain than you are. It's a model I want to present. Let me talk for a moment about the Society for Chaos Theory and Psychology in the Life Science organized Datapalooza. Just before travel was shutting down in response to the pandemic this spring, I was able to go to Utah for a few days to Datapalooza. For a data nerd like me, 2+ days of talking with some people about data, and who not only had data, but they had a desire to learn, and some other people who had knowledge of methods and a desire to learn, and putting them together in working groups and then getting out of the way was great. In my case, the gathering has created a number of collaborations. In fact, I'm going to be talking with some of these people and getting a couple papers out pretty soon from them. However, what made this conference a good learning experience was the collection of people. Everyone was interested in learning, in going the next few steps, not in presenting, not in socializing, not in dominating. They were interested in trajectories. There was a sense of forward motion. Sherry Reynolds wrote an educational psychology book, Learning is a Verb, that emphasized learning is a process rather than a static problem. Both are necessary, but our current research culture seems to emphasize the product at the expense of the process. And for those of you who are people, Sherry's son, Matt, scoffed at the title because, in his words, he said, learning is a gerund. All of that's just a long way to say that there are several models out there that perhaps are appropriate for this SIG. Perhaps viewing research as a trajectory may allow us new ideas about our gatherings. Now, will your administration allow you to do this and have them pay for it? I don't know. Will AERA allow you to do that? I don't know. Actually, I do know a little bit about that. None of these examples really has the perfect sense of being part of the larger journey, but we should explore some of these other ideas. This, I must note, is an additional difficulty for this SIG. AERA is rooted in positivism. Even when you go to a session that fights against positivism, notice we always see positivism in the foreground, that thing against which everything else is measured. Hence, the SIG in many ways is at cross purposes with AERA. So, research issue is approaching adaptation. I claim that education has clearly not adapted well to the changing world. And now adaptation is a broad field, and I just made a big claim. So let me give some examples of what I mean. My favorite example comes from the ability of people to calculate using fractions. It turns out that for American and older, there are two broad categories of people who are reasonably good. Upper middle class, economic class, mostly white boys, and lower economic class, mostly minority girls. So why is this? Well, boys like me spend a lot of time building scale models, planes, trains, automobiles, whatever. And so we knew well that 1 to 100 scale planes didn't work with 1 to 500 scale ships. In a similar way, girls who helped mom cook and so could double a recipe and so on, had skills before they showed up in math class. Hence, the people who showed up in prior understanding of proportion and built their fraction understandings on that base came out ahead. Other students who came with an impoverished or non-existent understanding of proportion didn't. Well, people younger than me grew up around designer clothes and fast food and video games, and so lacked the necessary foundation that helped previous generations succeed at fractions in school. And okay, I know the whole designer clothes, food, and video games is hyperbole. But did our curriculum or pedagogy change? No, not really. We didn't adapt at all. More recently, we went from not having computers to Stephen Wolfram's Wolfram Alpha being a $2.99 app on my phone. And guess what? Wolfram Alpha can about any math through and included some calculus. So in the words of his brother Conrad Wolfram, why do we teach math as if computers don't exist? Education has failed to adapt. Okay, we did adapt a little bit with graphing calculators in the 1990s, but not that much. And recently, while walking out of the grocery store, I saw a display with atlas and maps. For those of you who are really young, you can look up on a history site what an atlas is. Sort of shoved off to the side and out of everybody's way was this collection of New York State atlases and Rochester maps and things like that. Nowadays, everyone has GPS and they have a mapping app. However, unlike in the day of maps and atlases and globes, the maps on our phones only show a very local geography, not the larger city, state, or the country geography. I have to wonder how much of our ability to think globally atlases and globes. And what are we doing now that's different in response to the apps on our phones? I don't know, but I suspect we're in the midst of another failure to adapt. And as one last example, the pandemic has highlighted the ways in which higher education failed to adapt to the world around us in regards to the campus experience, unquote. How should higher education change? What role does higher education play in creating the pandemic and the post-pandemic worlds rather than just responding to them? Perhaps all of these questions have always been important. I don't know. I do know that they're important now, and I know that we don't have a good way to research adaptation. How should we study adaptation? Is there some correlation we could use? Well, maybe there is, but didn't I just go ahead and make the mistake of fitting the situation to a tool rather than the other way around? And isn't correlation reductive anyway? How do we characterize the adaptation of a system to another? And shouldn't we think about this the other way? Why doesn't society reflect education rather than asking education to adapt to society? Or perhaps even better, isn't the causality really circular? Do we even know what we mean by adaptation? I mean, I know it when I see it, but is there any way I can do better than that? All of these are both complex systems questions and in need of some serious epistemology and appropriate methods to study. I think that really most of the interesting ideas in complex systems research revolve around emergence and emergent behaviors. Phelan and Smith claim that locomotion phenomena, that walking on the fly, running on the fly. Components such as muscle strength combine. I want to get there quickly, or I want to stay in step with a partner, and metabolize the environment, whether I'm walking on a sidewalk or a sand dune or whatever, and some feedback, that is, I want to do things without spending too much energy or bones or things along the way, all lead us to a behavior. Notice that for locomotion, the optimized quantity, we actually want to reduce the amount of energy we use, which is where one feedback pathway operates. We change our states to achieve the one that allows us to use the minimum amount of energy for the coordination of these components, the intent, and the environment. We get something out of all of this. Now let's go on to learning. Can we identify, say, the components that we want for learning? Can we identify the intent of the learner, the environment, the feedback, an optimized quantity in the same way there is as energy in locomotion? For all of these is probably, think about Piaget. In the process of learning, onto our scheme until there's too much conflict in holding it, right? That energy expenditure is too great. As a physicist, this screams at something to optimize. Although, because I'm a physicist, you should be wary of me bringing physics ideas into this. And B, I wouldn't know exactly what the quantity is that we're trying to optimize. And C, the few ideas I have, I wouldn't know how to measure anyway without falling back into the positive trap. Sisyphus once again holds us from moving forward. Also, I believe that teaching is an emergent activity. Again, can we approach teaching in the same way? We haven't really done that. Instead, we say, here's the list of things, and the list of things equals teaching. It's not, we have tools, and we have intent, and we have environment, and we have feedback. Again, we need new tools to address both the identification of emergence and sort of to build those tools themselves. Ricca, Jordan, and Bowers made some important steps along this path, but not nearly enough. And as I said earlier, we're probably wrong anyway. There's a need to look at multiple scales, multiple scopes simultaneously, for example, individual and group, and to look at relationships across those. We also need something else. What change happens from one emergent state to the other? Is it only that the intent changes? Is there some sort of forward-looking metacognitive dynamic? I don't know. I don't know how we'd investigate that. But as long as we're here, let's look at sort of the fourth big thing that I think is important. To talk about trajectories. If I were to ask you sort of how you're feeling, you would give me maybe some idea about I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm bored, I'm whatever. However, in contrast to the positive reductionist analytic, dynamical systems approach to studying complex systems of interacting elements, and I believe that our emotions form that way, as does almost everything else, is to track the trajectory of system-level variables over time, examine their qualitative patterns, and relate these qualitative patterns to the rules of interaction among system components and the aspects of group content. System-level components over time, trajectories. This goes back to the very first meeting. Already people were worrying about chaos, and though chaos is necessary to study the time in nonlinear ways, but we knew it wasn't quite right. So how do we deal with these sorts of trajectories? As I said, if I ask you to explain to me how you're feeling, you may say, oh, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm whatever. From one perspective, you're going to give me an attractor. You're going to say, I'm sad. It's an attractor. Now, the question about emergence is this. From where do these states emerge? And it's important here, but there are two additional things to consider. First is there an optimized quantity and components that regulate feelings in some way? And if you don't want to talk about emotions, we can talk about learning, we can talk about teacher education, we can talk about any of those things. But it isn't just about that. Secondly, what causes, and I'm going to put cause in quotes, the move from attractive to attractor? When do I go from joy to happiness to sadness to whatever else? How does a classroom go from ruly, if that's a word, to unruly, or vice versa? Currently, I'm working with Chip Knight and Heather Littleton and lots of post-trauma data from hurricane survivors. The topic is, what clinical help can we learn from thinking about recovery and resilience from an attractive viewpoint? Is it even appropriate to think in these terms? Now, one way that we start to look at this is by looking at the transitions people undergo different emotions along a recovery. And are there particular transitions that they really see a lot of or they see very rarely? And does somebody recovering have a diagram that looks different in this respect than somebody who's not recovering well? And this raises all sorts of different questions, including ones for which we have no measures currently. For instance, is there a sort of zone of proximal development that helps with this? Is there some other way to go? So as a fifth one will be slightly more, Avi Kaplan asked me this question at AERA in 2018. What is the appropriate approach to aggregation in a complex system? At the time, I didn't have a great answer for him. I have a decent one now. First of all, let's be honest. Nobody is normal in the colloquial sense of the word, or in the statistical sense of the word. And in fact, normal distribution never happens. So from that viewpoint, non-parametric approaches should probably be the norm. However, we can go further. Crutchfield noticed we must infer from the system itself how it should be described and represented. Right? Use a non-parametric approach, we need to do something where the system tells us. And so here's a quick example of topological data analysis. So you'll notice that we have this arrangement here of 14 A's and a B. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly start referring those things and see what happens to the number of objects, 14, and the number of holes there. Notice that at this point, I've blurted enough, there are no holes. There's just the objects. And so if I continue further, there's also holes come and holes go. We can represent those on a diagram that's called a persistence diagram. In the persistence diagram, these red triangles are the holes, and the black dots are the objects themselves. Here are the 14 objects, and notice at some point the objects all disappear, just gets left over. Here are the initial 14 holes, but they all disappear rather quickly. Here are the objects, the little holes that are produced along the way. Notice anything along this line is born and dies at about the same time. So they're really, this system is best represented by 2 holes and 1 object, the B. Those A seem to matter much. So that's all I've got for today. Before we get into discussion, I'm going to put in one shameless plug. This all actually started back at a CCT SIG session back in 2013. And so it's not terrible that I make the following promotion about a book that'll be coming out next year. Quantitative Complex Systems Research Methods for the Social Sciences. Why this book? Well, first, because there's lots of good quantitative methods out there that are somewhat inaccessible. I hope this book will make them more accessible. And second, this book also tries to link the methods and the epistemology in ways that are better than existing statistics and complex systems text. Morin won't be completely happy with the book, and truth be told, I'm not going to be completely happy either, but it's a step along the journey. And so with that, there's the link to the slides down at the bottom if you want to see these, and it's got all the references and citations there. There's contact information for me, and I will turn it back over to, I guess, Serena or to Joanna, and we can talk a little bit further about things. So thank you.
Thank you, Barney. That was, as usual, from my perspective, my personal perspective, a roller coaster of a ride, as your presentations always are. That makes me think. You use so many metaphors that were just, very pertinent, very germane to the times that we're living in now. So I just want to thank you for giving us that roller coaster ride. It was very eye-opening for me. I was taking notes throughout. And I look forward to reading where you currently are now in 2021 when your book comes out, or at least it will be a representation of where you were when you submitted the final version, the final manuscript. Right. I'm sure you'll be somewhere else by the time it's published. So now we have some time to open it up for questions. And what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Serena, who has the control over the dashboard here.
Dr. Ricca, I have a question for you, if I may. I am sort of working towards a dissertation at this point, and it just sort of seems like all of the signs in complexity approaches sort of point towards hybridity, and I'm like hybridized sort of spaces. And I'm kind of curious how you see the role of a teacher, researcher, participant, presenter, as I sort of think about what the landscape looks like. Do you have any particular thoughts about some revised or reconceptualized roles within the complex perspective?
Yeah, and I think that your question's a good one, right? Because for years we've talked like participatory action research and all of those types of hybridized role people. I think those are an important step because they're telling us that, wait, there's not this separation between the researcher and the research, and we can't treat them differently. For years, right, as positivists, we did that. We said, oh yeah, we have researchers and they have one set of rules and the systems have a different set of rules. And that's clearly not right. There's ethical issues with that one that Deborah Osberg will point out, amongst other things. So I love the idea of researchers being embedded in the system. I think that's really, really important. And so that would be considered a hybridized role, as I understand it. The other thing that I think you need to do with some of these roles is to think about, oh, I may hybridize myself in some way, but I have to recognize that even that is not quite enough, because I really want the students, for example, if I'm going to study a classroom, I really want the students to be the researchers about the students. Teachers make great researchers about teachers, and they make better researchers about students than do academic researchers. but you really have to get as close to the data source and let the data source tell you, right? This is the thing Crutchfield said, the complex system has to tell us, the system itself has to tell us how to describe it, not us coming with our preconceived ideas. So I think the role of the hybridize that we have to go one step further on is, how is it that I'm going to allow myself to be the researcher when, if I'm talking about student learning, say, when it's really the students who are doing the research, right? It's the students presenting things. And I'm not sure exactly how I would do that, except I have to clearly learn to listen well. I have to learn to put my ego aside, and I have to put myself aside. And then I have to convince my committee that this is still me doing the work. So somebody just put in the room about practitioner research. And I think, again, that's the first step. But even that, practitioner researchers, if we're researching our own practice, but if we're researching the next sort of level in the system for researching, say, as teachers, we're researching students, I don't think even practitioner researcher goes far enough. So I don't know if that helps you out any, but there it is.
Thank you.
So we see Jane put in the chat that she likes the notion of the trajectory of research and the dynamic between attractors and motion. And what moves a system from an attractor is some sort of equilibrating event. So rather than looking for nice data, what might the role of bad data play in this process?
Right, and hello, one of who has been more CCT SIG has. I think she put in the chat earlier that she was the first president. So yeah, there are two roles for sort of bad data. The first is, goes back to Thalen and Smith, we usually think of variability as being bad, right? And we try to get threats to validity. We eliminate those things so we have data that's absolutely not variable in ways we don't want it. But variability, it turns out, has multiple components. One of them is variability is almost always a precursor to change. There are lots of things out there known as early warning signals, and there are lots of entropy-related methods where we say, oh, wait a minute, the bad data, this increased variability is telling us we're about to see some sort of change. Now, these are particularly problematic because we're normally sort of in a metastable state in one of these so-called attractors. The period of disequilibration and the period of reequilibration are typically very short compared to the attractor states, how long we spend in one of those before and after. So I may think one thing about how to add numbers, and then as I learn to add 3-digit numbers instead of 2-digit numbers, I'll be disequilibrated for a while. And then I'll be reequilibrated, but that typically happens even faster. And so how do we collect bad data? Normally we just collect good data and we miss the fact that anything happens. We have the beginning, we have the end, we don't know what happens in the middle, but look, there was a change. So we say, great, our ANOVA tells us for something good. And that's just part of, I think, what bad data tells us.
Cool. And so now, and I apologize if my pronunciations on things are bad, but Liru Hu has written that she's working on identifying attractors in collaborative discourse. And so she's wondering how to justify what she found meets the technical definition of attractor, and is there any mature method to detect attractors in collaborative discourse?
Okay, so I hear this here. One is, if you haven't seen, and the citation is in the slides, if you haven't seen and read Arrow, McGrath, and Berdahl's book that I quoted from, they do a very nice job of a lot of these things. They don't necessarily use the terminology of attractor, but they talk a lot about these trajectories, and they're very good at this. So the problem that we have with attractors in something like collaborative discourse is the same thing that we faced in the Ricca Jordan Bowers paper and many others, and that is we don't have continuous axes along things. Instead, we have categorical data. And categorical data, defining what the attractor is under categorical data, is a little bit trickier. People talk about using what are called state space grids, and I'm just typing that into the chat. And that's people can start looking at these things, but even that is a little bit tricky because a lot of times it's, oh, I have this picture, but I really don't know what an attractor would look like there. Is sad an attractor, or is the attractor the trajectory of me feeling a little sad followed by a little of this or a little of that? It's not clear in collaborative discourse and in many other things at what level you want to take the data, what the unit of analysis would be to determine what an attractor is. If you remember, right, an attractor is something that happens over time. We see this picture develop. So just having a snapshot of, oh, I'm sad. Well, if I tell you I'm sad, is that an attractor? Am I telling you about my state over time, or am I just telling you about a snapshot? So no, there's not a real good mature way to do this, especially with categorical data. Continuous data, yeah, we've got some ideas, but categorical data, it's not real well done. I would be happy to talk with you if you want, sort of offline about this, because that's sort of what Chip and Heather and I are dancing around right now.
So are there any other questions or comments that anyone would like to share? So you see Jamie Harrison wrote, can a role such as advocate be an attractor?
Well, I would ask this. What is the space in which you're looking? I mean, an attractor as opposed to what? So if you talk about the space of all the roles I could possibly have, then perhaps, but then, right, to define an attractor, we typically say there are components that make up this attractor. What are the components of being an advocate, and how are they coordinated in such a way?
Okay.
The big idea about a lot of attractors is we'll have multiple components, and if you coordinate them this way, you get an attractor that looks like this. And if you coordinate them a different way, you get an attractor that looks like that. So for example, if I move my legs alternately, I can walk. If I move my legs together, I can hop. It's the same motion, right? And it's almost the same range of motions for both of those types of behaviors, but they're coordinated differently. So what are the components that are being coordinated in such a way to make an advocate as opposed to coordinated in some other way to make some other role?
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Jane writes that her big takeaway is sad an attractor or a trajectory. And thinking of these ideas as trajectory and looking to explore the trajectories is similar to the move that Bill Pinar made with, I don't know how to pronounce that, as a process. She really likes that.
Yeah, and my answer to you is yes. And it depends upon this, right? And this is that with Chip and Heather, trauma and recovery, hurricanes. It depends upon how close to look in terms of time scale, right? Because with particular emotion, there's lots of things going on, but I can say, oh, well, this trajectory of feelings, this tells me I'm sad. But then if I back out, I say, okay, there's sort of a point that I see in the same way that originally in that diagram of A's and B's, we saw A's, but as you blur things, that is, as you sort of move out, you then see the B's. So if we're looking at the trajectory of resilience and recovery from trauma, then sad would be an attractor along the way. If I zoom in further, then sad is probably a trajectory, at least a coordination of a bunch of things. And so I can't answer your question really is without thinking about at what time scale we want to look at. And so I didn't say a whole lot about time scales, but that's something, and I know I talked with Bill Pinar just, like this much, and talked with Bill Dahl more about it, of, yeah, on a big time scale, Chiara, is a process, curriculum's a process, right? On a different time scale, curriculum looks like a, right? Are we talking about what happens in the classroom day to day, or are we talking about what happens to a student over 12 years of schooling? So yeah, I mean, clearly in by both of those bills.
So I think we might have time for one more question or comment. If anyone has anything else, we see Jane has added trajectory of resilience. There are many psychological constructs that could be problematized for educators.
Yeah. And all of you who are teachers or have been teachers, you know that one. You know exactly where it goes, because so much of what happens shows up in the classroom that they never told you about in school, and they never told you about in your teacher education program, and it never shows up in professional development, but this is the life we live right now. So, you know, I think we need more of that. But again, that's a business of, we don't just have a system, we have it's within an environment, and that environment includes all of these psychological constructs of all of our students and of ourselves and of our principals and of everybody else. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Barney, for agreeing to do this. I'm so sad that we're not able to meet in San Francisco and that we're not able to meet in Orlando here in a few months, but we're definitely looking forward to 2022. I think it's in San Diego. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to continue this conversation with our next webinars. So if you have any ideas or thoughts of what you might like to see in a webinar, please feel free to reach out to me and email me. Again, I'm going to put my email in the chat, so because we're always welcome and looking forward to new ideas. So if anyone has any, oh, I misspelled my first name. Hang on, let me try that again. The plastic coverings over the keyboards.
While Serena's doing that, I just want to also just thank Barney again, and thanks Serena for being willing to put this webinar together and battle with all the technological issues that came along with it. So thank you, Barney, and thank you, Serena, and to everyone that's here hanging on with us in this webinar. You know, if you're not a member of the SIG, if you join the SIG, we send out regular newsletters, we host events like this, we serve a networking function amongst ourselves too, so we hope that you will join. And if you are a member of the SIG, please bring a friend when you renew your AERA membership, and let's grow this complex system of educational researchers, as Barney said. So thank you.
Thank you.